Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This paper is the philosophy of law. The module is on civil disobedience. The main objectives of this module is to learn about the three most important philosophical theories related to civil disobedience. This module was written by Manohar Kumar from IIT Delhi. I'm Akash Singh Rathod from the Lewis University in Rome. What is civil disobedience? Civil disobedience is a form of protest that contrasts with other forms such as conscientious objection, revolutionary action, and other legal forms of dissent. Civil disobedience is an intentional breaking of the law, directly or indirectly, in order to protest against an unjustified law or a policy. When I say breaking of a law directly or indirectly, what that suggests is that I might, as a civil disobedient, the person engaged in civil disobedience, I might, as a disobedient, break the very law that I'm opposed to. That would be a direct practice of civil disobedience. Or, alternatively, I might break another law, and in the process of breaking that other law, raise attention and awareness about the law to which I object. So that would be an indirect form. For example, let's assume that the law prohibits the local production of salt. In that case, as a civil disobedient, I can take direct action and produce salt. Alternatively, I could arrange the interference with a convoy shipping salt. In that interference, I'm not violating the law about the production of salt. Rather, I'm violating laws of public order and hindrance to traffic and so on. So this is an indirect method. I mentioned this example because we'll return to it also later. The need for civil disobedience may also arise due to democratic deficits or lack of avenues for deliberative participation for citizens. So in this respect, you can see the distinction between civil disobedience and the ordinary course of dissent within the legal framework. That's the ordinary run of democracy that we should discuss, debate, and dissent. However, in the ordinary run of democracy, once the debate is concluded, the law has been established, everybody is subject to that law, whether or not we approved of it prior to the vote or not. Civil disobedience, however, suggests that after the publication of the law, we can infringe that law, violate that law, in order to raise awareness about its injustice and our objection to it. So in this sense, it works outside of the framework of the usual democratic process. Civil disobedience is largely a public and a communicative act that seeks to inform other citizens of what the disobedient sees to be wrong. And here we see the difference between conscientious objection on the one hand and civil disobedience on the other hand. Conscientious objection is the refusal to participate in what is prescribed by law, without necessarily declaring the law as absolutely unjust. Conscientious objection, for example, includes the refusal to go to war when your country has declared war. You might not be holding the position that this war is inherently unjust and nobody should participate in it. Rather, as a conscientious objector, you would say that I object to participating in it because it violates my sense of conscience or my religion or what have you. So there are differences then that are clear between civil disobedience and conscientious objection, revolutionary action, which uses violence and intends to overthrow the entire framework of law, and other legal forms of dissent. So civil disobedience is quite distinct from all of these other forms of dissent. Let's get into the main theories of civil disobedience, the main political philosophical theories that have been developed in order to understand the nature of civil disobedience, the justness or righteousness of civil disobedience, and the conditions under which it should or should not be practiced. These theories are primarily three. One is the liberal tradition that appeared in the writings of John Rawls. The other is the Republican account, which has appeared in the writings of Daniel Markovits. And the third is the deliberative or democratic deficit account, which appears in the writings of William Smith. We'll begin with John Rawls. The political philosopher John Rawls is credited with giving the most accepted definition of civil disobedience. It's a rather wide one, so people find very little fault with it. Rawls argues that civil disobedience, and I quote, is a public, non-violent, conscientious yet political act contrary to law, usually done with the aim of bringing about a change in the law or policies of government. Now you can see in the terms that Rawls uses that he himself differentiates civil disobedience from conscientious objection. In other words, he called it a conscientious but political act. Conscientious objection is a conscientious but moral and personal act. He also states that it has the aim to uphold the legal regime in general, but oppose a particular unjust law. In that respect, it's not like revolutionary action. Now, there are some conditions that Rawls lays out so that the civil disobedient is engaged in action that can widely be accepted as just. We all know that it's not lawful, that's the very point of it, but is what is not lawful wrong? No, there are many cases where pursuing the illegal act is the morally righteous and just thing to do. Well, we need certain conditions to teach us how do we know. We can't just start violating this law and that law and say, no, this is the right thing to do. So political philosophers lay down conditions and criteria, and the ones that the liberal political philosopher John Rawls has laid down are quite clear and easy to understand. The first of which is that an act of civil disobedience is only justified when the current arrangements in the society depart largely from publicly accepted standards of justice. In other words, just because I don't like a law does not mean that in the process of violating it, I'm practicing civil disobedience. Rather, that law should be widely understood to depart from our shared sense of what is a just law, what is the just thing to mandate, what is the just thing to prohibit. If people don't widely share the understanding that this particular law is unjust, then the act of violating it cannot be qualified as civil disobedience. Another condition that Rawls lays down in his idea of civil disobedience is that the act should be done in public, in full public view. That the disobedient should be willing to face the law, and that in the process of facing the law, the public can see the sincerity of the act of disobedience. In other words, I shouldn't be hiding just a kind of criminal behavior behind the excuse of civil disobedience. Now, how do we ensure that that's not happening? In this twofold suggestion of Rawls, we should do our activity in full view of public, and what that suggests is that the public should be able to see what you're doing, but also that you should be able to give reasons in a public language. In other words, you should be able to account for what you're doing through what's called the public use of reason. In other words, rational arguments that can be shared by everybody in society. The other aspect was fidelity to the law, the willingness to accept punishment. This shows the sincerity of the act, and it also very crucially shows that we are not opposed fully to law as such. We recognize the need for law to stabilize human relationships, to regulate our behavior, and so on. So we're opposed to a particular law because it does not conform to a widely shared view of a just law. Accepting punishment is not only morally important, according to the liberal tradition, it's also pragmatically important because it allows the disobedient to communicate, to stage their reasons for disobedience, and in so doing, to enlist widespread support for that action. This is known as the theatrical moment in law. as you probably know, Gandhi was very good at this, staging the occasion for submitting to punishment as as a means for the full expression of his disobedience. In other words, one can violate the law, transgress the law, get arrested, and then just remain silent. But this does not qualify the publicity requirement. Instead, in the process of accepting the punishment, you articulate the reasons why you violated the law. And in the process, you put the law on trial rather than having the law put the disobedient on trial. Another condition in the liberal account for an action to qualify as civil disobedience is that it should be non-violent. And finally, according to John Rawls, the act of civil disobedience needs to be an act of last resort, undertaken only when all of the normal channels of dissent available to you are absent. So with these conditions, we can clearly distinguish and differentiate mere illegal action, criminal action, various kinds of immoral behavior, various kinds of personal, let's say, idiosyncrasy, from truly conscientious and political civil disobedience, the kind that has inspired many people around the world, the kind that we recognize in Gandhi, in Martin Luther King, and so on. These are not normal, ordinary, mundane violations of the law. They reach a different level of magnitude and help to create a more just legal framework. Republicans are not Republicans as a position in political philosophy are not satisfied with the liberal account of civil disobedience, and they've offered an alternative account. It doesn't replace the liberal account, but it supplements it. The concern of the Republican political theorists such as Daniel Markovits is that civil disobedience, according to the liberal account, doesn't direct enough attention to the democratic nature, fundamentally democratic nature of disobedience. Daniel Markovits' position is not simply that civil disobedience is opposition to a law because of its unjustness, but that it has a wider democratic function. Democratic disobedience, as he calls it, takes into account democratic deficits in law and policy that inevitably threaten every democracy. What are these democratic deficits? Such deficits exist when the policies produced by the government or the state deviate from the will of the people. And keep in mind that this is the basic assumption of Republican theories of political philosophy, that the republic or the government is meant to represent and enact the will of the people. So from the Republican point of view, civil disobedience also needs to be calibrated along with this idea that the whole function of government lawmaking is to embody the will of the people in a legal regime. In that sense, the democratic deficit can be corrected by the acts of civil disobedience. These deficits arise when there's an unbridgeable gap between the existing policy and the ideas or the will of the people, when the interests of the people are not taken into account in the process of producing policy, or the interests of the people have substantially changed since law was made. I think a good example of civil disobedience according to the Republican model could be gay pride marches in a lot of contemporary countries. Many countries still have discriminating laws against sodomy, homosexual activities, and discriminate against being gay. That is the legal order which represented the will of the people at a certain point in the past. But largely, the people's conceptions have changed, and so the gay pride marches that occur, which are largely illegal because they're flouting certain criminal prohibitions, these marches can be seen as an attempt to engage in civil disobedience to fulfill the prerogatives of the will of the majority and how that's changed since law was made. So filling in the democratic deficit. Now, for Markovits, and I quote, "Political disobedience might, in appropriate circumstances, be justified as a counterweight to the inertial institutions and practices that correct and cure democratic authority, but that inevitably misfire on occasion and produce democratic deficits." Now, what he's suggesting is that policy making is inertial. In other words, once that the will of the majority goes into the processes of governmental mechanisms to produce law, it follows a certain logic of its own. It follows the logic of legal production. Now, that logic of its own is inherently status quo. It's inherently conservative because the entire point of the law is to stabilize society and not allow too much revolutionary instability to creep in. What can happen as a consequence of this inherent stabilizing and status quo effect of legal production, or the production of laws out of the will of the people, is that precisely what the people willed is not precisely reflected in the law that comes out of the legal production, the legal lawmaking apparatus. What that means for Markovits is that consequently civil disobedience may be necessary at the end of the lawmaking process in order to force a tweaking of the resultant law so that it conforms more closely to the will of the people that was meant to be captured in that law in the first place. So after discussing the liberal model of civil disobedience and the Republican idea of civil disobedience, which attempts to supplement the liberal one, let's turn to the deliberative account of civil disobedience, which is put forward by the political theorist William Smith. The deliberative disobedience model seeks the need to explain some aspect of civil disobedience which is left out of the liberal and the Republican model. The deliberative account takes cognizance of requirements of disobedience when public policy making does not provide ample space for citizens. In other words, the deliberative model targets civil disobedience not just at the lawmaking apparatus, but rather at the realm of civil society. So let's try to understand what William Smith means by this need for any theory of civil disobedience to take into account the targeting of civil disobedience towards civil society. In the decision-making processes, in the production of policy in government, what is supposed to happen according to our models of policy making is that those who make policy should consult with civil society, should consult with experts, we refer to them as technocrats, for example, and should consult with the body politic at large. According to this model, government, the actual state, is one level, which is on top of another level called civil society, which includes not only the market and commercial interests, but also academia, intellectual interests, experts, NGOs, and other organizations. And then this is one level above the private realm. So this distinction, this sort of tripartite distinction between the private realm, the realm of the family, which is of course crucial for any state to function, the realm of civil society, and then on top, the realm of the state. Well, so far we've been discussing civil disobedience more or less in terms of the personal in relation to the state. This model suggests that civil disobedience plays out largely in this intervening realm of civil society. We see this because theories of governance and policy making always suggest that civil society should be taken account of in the process of producing policy, but does it? According to William Smith, an act of civil disobedience is justified, and I quote, when processes of public deliberation fail to respect principles of a deliberative democracy in the following three ways. So these are the three faults of the process of policy making in relation to those two layers I was telling you about, the political and the civil society level. So when there are three faults in that, civil disobedience is justified. So what are the three faults? One, when deliberation is insufficiently inclusive. Two, when it's manipulated by powerful participants. And three, when it's insufficiently informed. And inclusivity is crucial here. So as I was mentioning, public policy is produced by the state, but it should be done in a kind of round table where members of civil society are invited. That's the inclusiveness. In the process of inviting members of civil society, including academics and technocrats, that means the policymakers are sufficiently informed. That's the other condition that William Smith mentions. And thirdly, this practice of policy making shouldn't be captured by some particular powerful interest. If any of these three things are not done properly, if policy making is captured, for example, we all know that in India, the policies related to oil expedition, drilling, and so on are captured by powerful interests like Reliance, and we know that the laws regulating environmental practices are captured by powerful mining companies and so on. In these cases, civil disobedience can be justified according to this third theory of civil disobedience, which we call the deliberative model. According to Smith, the aim of the civil disobedient is, and I quote, to stimulate processes of communication and argumentation within civil society itself. So this is different from the private and the state antagonism that we can see in certain kinds of theories of civil disobedience, specifically the liberal one. And in this model, what the disobedient is doing is he's engaging in the normal, vibrant processes of debate at the level of civil society and attempting to inform civil society of policies that are being enacted by government that violate the basic conditions of deliberation that should be grounding any policy produced by the state. So when any policy is produced by the state, there are basic conditions that should be fulfilled. The disobedient will alert civil society to the fact that these conditions have not been fulfilled. So these are the three main theories of civil disobedience in contemporary political philosophy that legal philosophers often contend with when they are discussing violations of the law, the reasons behind violations of the law, the moral justness of those violations, and so on. And in each of them, I mentioned at least three issues or three criteria, three terms that continuously pop up. One was publicity, one was violence, and one was punishment. Now, each of the three conceptions of civil disobedience have something to say about the role of publicity, about the role of violence, and about the role of submitting oneself to punishment. But these are not uncontested ideas. So let's go through these three concepts and see what kind of debate there is about what sort of justifications there are for mandating them for any act to be regarded as civil disobedience. Now, the need for publicity in the act of civil disobedience is debated. John Rawls and other liberal theorists support the need for publicity since the disobedient is required to provide public reasons for disobeying laws. He also argued that it shows a certain sincerity of commitment. Now, critics suggest that the need for publicity can often interrupt the very process of civil disobedience itself. Now, you remember the example that I gave about an indirect form of civil disobedience by not violating the law against the production of salt. So if I'm opposed to the law that states that salt cannot be produced locally, I can violate it directly by producing salt. Alternatively, I can violate it indirectly by blocking a caravan, taking a number of other civil disobedience together, and in some surprise way marching out into the street and lying down and blocking a caravan of salt from reaching its destination, the warehouse. This form of indirect civil disobedience illustrates quite clearly that the publicity requirement might interfere with the act of civil disobedience being effective. If I should say that at 5 a.m. on this day we are going to block a caravan of salt because it is my moral and political obligation as a civil disobedient to do so, obviously they're just going to drive in another route. So this publicity requirement causes a great strain on the civil disobedient. Consequently, many people have argued that the publicity requirement is an unfair demand on civil disobedience in order to qualify as civil disobedience. John Rawls then introduced a revised conception of civil disobedience, wherein he said that the publicity requirement stands, however, it can be delayed after the event. So while the civil disobedient, in order to qualify as a legitimate civil disobedient, must publicly give reasons for his violation of the law and must publicly announce what he is doing, he does not necessarily have to do it before the event, but he is obligated to do it sometime in order for that illegal act to qualify as civil disobedience. Let's move on to the contentious issue of violence. Civil disobedience ideally should be non-violent. The disobedient should not pose a threat to the life and property of others. As you may be aware, there was a great deal of debate in India between Gandhi and others whether violence should be introduced during certain acts of disobedience and resistance. Gandhi was always behind the let's say the unbreakable condition of nonviolence. The same thing happened in the United States during the civil rights movement, debates between Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. Martin Luther King, following Gandhi, was consistently nonviolent. He would not give that up as a principle. Malcolm X, however, advocated violence as part of the more efficacious means of getting the civil disobedience recognized. Why do we advocate nonviolence? Some philosophers say that the nonviolent character of civil disobedience shows a basic fidelity to the law, not to a particular unjust law, but to the conception of law as such. If we were to use violence in order to make our point, then the act of using violence shows a condemnation of legal principles as such. Others say that nonviolence is a strategic device, that it helps in enlisting the support of others. And this is clear in the case of Gandhi's actions and in the case of Martin Luther King, when the civil disobedience or satyagrahis just submitted themselves to violence but refused to engage in violence themselves. This elicited large-scale sympathy for their actions and a recognition of the moral sincerity of their commitment. But there are alternative arguments. The possibly most important living philosopher of law today, Joseph Ratz, has made the intriguing claim that sometimes nonviolence causes more public harm than violence. That's something we have to ponder further. Alternatively, sometimes violence, if used in a limited way, can be used to draw more attention than a nonviolent act would draw. So if the aim of civil disobedience is partly to draw a great deal of public attention to the injustice of the law, or according to the deliberative model, to draw civil society's attention toward gaps in policy making, then small injections of violence might be far more effective than nonviolence, some critics say. Finally, what about the idea of punishment? Fidelity to the law requires that the disobedient agrees to be punished. Agreeing to be punished is something that Gandhi always did in his acts of civil disobedience. However, it's not the case that fidelity to the law was the reason that he did it. So how can we understand this liberal position that we submit to punishment in order to show fidelity to the law? Well, there are counter-narratives to this. We can also see accepting punishment as a communicative act. In other words, the submission to punishment is not done because we agree with the overall legal regime. After all, Gandhi did not agree with the overall legal regime. Rather, it can be seen as an opportunity for the theatrical or communicative event. In other words, the way that we can most widely raise awareness of what we are doing as a civil disobedient and why we're doing it, the justness of our cause. Now, according to the liberal and the Republican and the deliberative models, submitting oneself to punishment shows a kind of sincerity of conviction to uphold laws in general. However, we should be clear that in a democratic environment like pre-1947 India, this does not necessarily cover the motivations behind civil disobedience at that time. Now, one last thing on this idea of submitting to punishment. Alternative models of history, like social historian Howard Zinn, argues that maybe we shouldn't even submit ourselves to punishment. After all, the disobedient doesn't believe in the law that he's submitting himself to be punished by. So maybe more thoroughgoing civil disobedience should not only violate the law itself, but violate the consequences of violating the law itself. Zinn suggests this because his conception of history is not focused on particular heroes like Martin Luther King or Mahatma Gandhi. Rather, he suggests that large populations of people, the poor, the oppressed, the subaltern, have always been engaged in civil disobedience, but they don't get recognized as civil disobedience according to dominant historical and political narratives. And I think Zinn has quite a good point to make there. Now, let's conclude. This model has shown a rich trajectory of theories of civil disobedience, and it shows that these theories don't have settled concepts. They're open to deep disagreement. For example, publicity, violence, the willingness to take punishment. There is no agreement on these terms. There's also disagreement about the reasons for disobeying the law. So, one can disobey the law due to them being unjust, as is suggested in the liberal model. One can disobey the law due to the presence of democratic deficits within institutions, such as advocated in the Republican model, and one can violate laws because the public policies are insufficiently deliberative. These three conceptions of civil disobedience do not necessarily stand in opposition to one another, but they can be seen to supplement each other. And finally, we should keep in mind that these three conceptions of civil disobedience are post-democratic. In other words, they more or less apply to conditions where the state is striving to be just. And in that respect, if we want to think about civil disobedience prior to, for example, 1947 India, we might have to think about it in certain different ways and perhaps generate certain other rival conceptions of civil disobedience in order to understand those events more clearly. Thank you very much.